There is a photograph from the first day of rehearsal on The Carol Burnett Show, taken in September of 1975, that shows two men standing next to each other against a white wall. One of them is laughing, the other is not. The one who is laughing is Harvey Korman. The one who is not laughing is Tim Conway. This was, in almost every important sense, the entire relationship in a single frame. Harvey laughed, Tim did not. Harvey fell apart, Tim held together. Harvey slid off chairs and doubled over and pressed his hands into his face and shook with the particular helpless laughter of a man who has completely lost the ability to control his own response to something, and Tim sat through all of it with an expression of mild and genuine puzzlement, as though he could not imagine what everyone around him found so amusing. For 11 years on The Carol Burnett Show, this was the dynamic, and for 11 years, everyone who watched it assumed the same thing. That Tim Conway was the funniest man in the room, and Harvey Korman was the one who could not keep a straight face, and that was all there was to know about it. Nobody knew the other part. Nobody knew what Tim had been doing, deliberately and quietly and with complete intention, on every single day of those 11 years. Nobody knew that what looked like a comedian being funny was actually a man keeping his friend alive. Not until the night of February 14, 1979, on The Tonight Show stage, when Harvey Korman reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out something he had been carrying for 4 years without knowing whether he would ever find the moment to give it back. But before we go there, I want to ask you to do something. I notice every week in the comments that people who have been watching these stories for months did not know they were not subscribed to this channel. If you watch these videos, if they find you at the right moment, please take 10 seconds and make sure you are subscribed. It is free, and it is the one thing that allows us to keep making these stories. Thank you for being here. Now let us start at the beginning. Because before there was a photograph, and before there was a February night when the funniest man on television made The Tonight Show go completely silent, there was a first day of rehearsal in the summer of 1975. And two men standing in a hallway, and something that passed between them in the first 5 minutes that neither of them would ever be entirely able to explain. Harvey Herschel Korman was born in Chicago on February 15, 1927, and by the time he arrived at The Carol Burnett Show in 1967, he had spent 20 years developing the particular kind of comic instrument that made him, in the judgment of most people who worked with him professionally, one of the finest sketch comedy performers in the history of American television. He was a classically trained actor who had come to comedy through legitimate theater, which gave him something that pure comedy performers sometimes lack, which is the ability to be entirely real inside a ridiculous situation. When Harvey Korman played a character, regardless of how absurd the character was or how outlandish the sketch surrounding it, there was a quality of genuine commitment to the reality of the scene that made everything funnier by contrast. He was tall and physically expressive and capable of enormous range, and he was, by the mid-1970s, a television institution in the most complete sense of that phrase. What he was not, during a significant portion of those years, was happy, not in the private sense. Not in the sense that mattered most. His first marriage, to Donna Ellert, had been troubled for years in the particular way that marriages between people who are fundamentally good but fundamentally incompatible are troubled, quietly, and with accumulating weight, until the weight becomes something that cannot be sustained any longer. He carried the difficulty of this the way he carried most difficult things, inwardly and without much visible expression of it, because Harvey Korman had been raised in the particular tradition of men who do not put their interior lives into public circulation and who regard emotional disclosure as a form of imposition on the people around them. He was funny in public, and he was professional, and he was warm, and he was, in the private corners of himself that very few people ever saw, struggling in a way that was becoming harder to keep separate from everything else. The Carol Burnett Show was, during those years, both the thing that sustained him and the thing that made the private difficulty most visible to the one person who was paying close enough attention to see it. That person was Tim Conway. Thomas Daniel Conway was born in Willoughby, Ohio, on December 15, 1933. He had been making people laugh since before he had a vocabulary large enough to explain how he was doing it, which was appropriate because what he was doing was operating below the level where explanation was useful. His comic instrument was his body and his timing, the particular combination of physical information and rhythmic precision that cannot be taught and cannot be fully described and can only be recognized when you see it, the way you recognize a perfect musical tone without being able to define the physics of why it is perfect. He had spent decades perfecting a persona that presented to the world as hapless, as befuddled, as a man to whom the ordinary operations of the physical world were a continuous source of mild and unresolvable surprise. The persona was entirely constructed, off camera. Tim Conway was one of the most precisely observant people in any room he entered. He noticed things. He noticed people. He noticed, in the particular way that very intelligent people who have spent their lives behind a comic mask notice things, what was happening beneath the surfaces of the people around him. And what he noticed, in the first months of working with Harvey Korman on The Carol Burnett Show, was that Harvey was in serious trouble and had no idea how to ask anyone for help. What Tim did about that is the part that nobody knew. For 11 years, it was the most private part of everything that happened between them on that stage, and it is what makes what Harvey said on The Tonight Show stage on Valentine's Day of 1979 the thing that it was. But first, you need to understand what the laughter actually was, because it was not what it looked like from the outside. It was not what it looked like from the outside at all. Wait, because what you are about to learn about the 11 years before that February night changes every single thing you think you know about the funniest friendship in the history of American television comedy. The dynamic between Tim Conway and Harvey Korman on The Carol Burnett Show was, by the mid-1970s, the most reliably beloved recurring element in American sketch comedy. The premise was simple and inexhaustible. Tim would do something in a sketch, and Harvey would lose his ability to maintain the fiction of the scene. He would begin to laugh, and once Harvey began to laugh, it was over. The scene was gone, the character was gone, and what remained was Harvey Korman himself, helpless, shaking, occasionally sliding toward the floor, pressing his fists into his face, and making the high-pitched sounds of a man who has been ambushed by his own nervous system and can do nothing but surrender to it. Audiences adored it. The letters that came into the production office about Tim and Harvey outnumbered the letters about any other element of the show by a margin that the production staff found almost embarrassing. There was something in the sight of Harvey losing control that resonated with people in a way that went beyond simply finding it funny, something in the freedom of it, the involuntary release of it, the proof that even a professional comedian could be so completely undone by something funny that the professionalism became irrelevant. But what the audiences did not know, and what the production staff did not fully understand, and what Harvey Korman himself did not understand until much later, was the architecture of what Tim was actually doing. Tim Conway was not simply being funny. He was being funny with a particular person in mind. He was watching Harvey from the corner of his eye in every sketch they shared, reading Harvey's state, reading the quality of Harvey's containment on any given day, and calibrating what he did in the scene to what he could see Harvey needed. On days when Harvey came to rehearsal carrying the weight of his private life more visibly than usual, Tim's bits in those rehearsals were different from the bits on days when Harvey seemed okay, more layered, more precisely timed, more designed to reach the specific frequency of Harvey's laughter rather than the room's general amusement. Tim was, in the language of his craft, performing to an audience of one, and the audience of one did not know. Harvey genuinely believed, for all of those years, that what Tim was doing was what it looked like, an exceptionally gifted comedian doing what he did, and Harvey's response being the involuntary byproduct of that talent. It took a photograph and a Valentine's Day and a Tonight Show stage for Harvey to find out the truth. And the truth, when it arrived, was of the specific kind that dismantles everything you thought you understood about the years that preceded it and makes you rebuild the entire structure of memory with different materials. But before we get to the photograph, you need to be in that studio on February 14th, 1979. You need to understand what happened in the first 47 minutes of the broadcast, before everything changed. Because without the laughter that came first, the silence that followed would not have been what it was. Johnny Carson had been trying to get Tim Conway and Harvey Korman on The Tonight Show together for 2 years. Not separately, not one followed by the other in the usual rotation of celebrity guests, but together, at the same time, sharing the guest chair in the particular way that two people who have built something extraordinary together share a space, with the ease of people for whom the other person's proximity is simply the natural state of things. There had been scheduling conflicts, there had been production commitments, there had been the ordinary friction of arranging two very busy people's calendars to overlap in the right place at the right time. But on the night of February 14th, 1979, both men were available, and Johnny Carson had the broadcast he had been waiting for. Ed McMahon's introduction of them that night was one of the longer ones in the show's recent memory, because Ed, who loved both men with the uncomplicated warmth of a man who has been made to laugh by people he likes, wanted to give the audience time to understand who they were receiving. He spoke about the Carol Burnett show, about the 11 years of sketches that had become part of the fabric of American comedy, about the specific phenomenon of Harvey's inability to maintain composure in Tim's presence. The audience was already laughing before the curtain had opened, which was the particular gift of a well-constructed introduction. And then Tim Conway and Harvey Korman walked out together, and Studio One at NBC Burbank became something that it was not often permitted to be, which was simply a room full of people experiencing pure, uncomplicated, involuntary joy. They sat down. They greeted Johnny. They settled into the natural rhythm of two people who have spent 11 years in close professional proximity and have developed the specific ease that comes from knowing exactly where the other person is going to be without needing to look. And then Tim said something. It was not a joke, exactly. It was more in the nature of an observation, delivered with the particular flatness that was Tim's signature. The deadpan so complete that it seemed less like a technique than like a constitutional condition, as though Tim Conway had simply been born unable to register the absurdity of things the way other people did. The observation lasted approximately 8 seconds. It landed on Harvey Korman like a physical impact. Harvey's face went first. It always went first. The face, before the sound, before the body, as though his nervous system received the information and began responding before his brain had fully processed what he had heard. He pressed his lips together. He looked at the desk. He looked at the ceiling. He looked at Johnny Carson, who was already showing the first signs of his own loss of composure. The particular quality of Johnny's laugh, that began very quietly and built in stages, a private smile becoming a broader grin, becoming the full and entirely genuine laughter of a man who has been ambushed by something funnier than he was prepared for. Harvey pressed both hands flat against his face. He made the sound, the specific Harvey Korman sound, that 11 years of Carol Burnett show audiences had come to know the way they knew their own names. The high-pressured escaping sound of laughter that cannot be fully contained, leaking through the fingers of both hands, pressed against a face that can no longer perform the fiction of composure. He began to slide, not quickly, not in a single dramatic movement, but in the particular slow gravitational surrender that Harvey's full losses of composure always involved. A gradual removal of structural integrity, as though his bones were deciding one by one to stop participating. Johnny Carson had both hands pressed against his desk. His head was going down. His shoulders were shaking with the specific rhythm of someone who is trying to maintain the outward form of professional composure while everything inside has already abandoned the attempt. He went forward. His forehead touched the desk. He lay there for a moment, his shoulders still shaking, and the audience of 300 people who had been laughing before were now past laughter and into something that does not have a simple name, the kind of response that happens in the body before language can reach it. And through all of it, Tim Conway sat in his chair with the expression of a man waiting for a bus. Still, patient, looking around the room with mild interest, perhaps slightly puzzled by the response. This went on for 7 minutes and 23 seconds. Carson's production team confirmed the time afterward, because they had been watching the clock in the control room with a mixture of delight and genuine professional concern, unsure whether they should attempt to reassert some structure over the broadcast, or simply let what was happening continue to happen. They chose to let it happen. They were right. Do not look away from what happens next. Because what Harvey Korman did in the moment after the laughter finally began to subside, the moment after he straightened up in his chair and wiped his face and took 3 breaths and looked at Tim Conway with the expression of a man who has just survived something and is not entirely sure how, is the part of this story that nobody has told. Nobody. Not in any interview, not in any memoir, not in any profile or documentary or tribute that came after. What Harvey did next happened on live television in front of millions of Americans, and it was the realest thing Harvey Korman ever did in public. And it started with his hand going into the inside pocket of his jacket. He did not do it immediately. He sat for a moment first, in the aftermath of the laughter, while the studio settled back into something like normal order, while Johnny composed himself, and Ed McMahon wiped his eyes and the audience found its way back to the baseline that precedes what happens next. Harvey sat in his chair and looked at Tim, not the look he usually gave Tim in the aftermath of a lost composure moment, which was the exasperated, helpless, affectionate look of a man who has been betrayed by his own nervous system again, and holds the person responsible in a kind of warm contempt for it. This was a different look. This was the look of a man who has decided to do something he has been putting off for a long time, and who has just found the moment, and who is not going to let the moment pass. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. He took out a photograph. Not large, the size of a photograph you carry in a wallet or a pocket, the size of a thing you carry on your person rather than display on a wall. Black and white, worn at one corner in the way that things get worn when they have been handled many times over many years. He held it for a moment without saying anything. Johnny Carson, who had been reaching for his water glass, went still. The glass stayed on the desk. Tim looked at the photograph. His expression, which had been the performing expression, the one that said he was mildly confused about why anyone found anything funny, changed, not dramatically. Tim Conway's expressions never changed dramatically, but something shifted in it, a quality of recognition perhaps, or of waiting for something he had not been sure was coming. Harvey said, "I found something in my dressing room 4 years ago. It was in a drawer, under some old scripts." He held the photograph out toward Tim, face down, so the image was not visible. "On the back of this," he said, "there is something written in your handwriting. I have been carrying it ever since I found it, because I have been trying to figure out the right moment to ask you about it." Johnny Carson set his water glass down very carefully. He did not make a sound. The studio was completely still. 7 minutes ago, 300 people and the host and the floor crew and the camera operators had been in the helpless grip of laughter that operated below the level of choice. Now the same room, the same 300 people and the same host and the same crew and the same cameras were in the grip of something else entirely. Something that also operated below the level of choice, but in a different register. Harvey turned the photograph over. The image showed 2 men on a set, both in costume for a sketch. One of them was laughing. The other was not. Harvey held it so Tim could see it. "You know what this is," Harvey said. Tim looked at the photograph. He looked at it for a long time. "Yes," Tim said. Harvey turned the photograph back over so he could see the writing on the back. He read it aloud. It said, "You are the funniest person I have ever known, and I am the luckiest." 3 words at the bottom of the message. 3 words that Tim had written below the rest, smaller than the other writing, as though they had been added after the main message, and were slightly less certain of their right to be there. The 3 words were, "Thank you, Harv." Harvey held the photograph. He was not performing anything. He was simply sitting in a chair holding a photograph with writing on the back, and the expression on his face was the most unguarded thing that most of the people in that studio had ever seen on a public figure. Johnny Carson's jaw was tight. He had his hand over his mouth. Ed McMahon was looking at the desk. Harvey said, "I want to know something, Tim. I want to know when you wrote this." Tim was quiet for a moment. Then he said, October 12th, 1971. Harvey was quiet. Do you remember what was happening in October of 1971? Harvey said. Tim said, yes. Harvey looked at him. Tell me what you knew, he said. What Tim Conway knew in October of 1971 was this. He knew that Harvey Korman's marriage was ending in the particular way that endings that have been approaching for years finally arrive, not as a single event, but as a settling into what has already been true for a long time. He knew that Harvey had been coming to the Carol Burnett show set during that period, carrying the weight of a private life that was in serious difficulty, in the specific way that Tim knew because Tim watched Harvey, had always watched Harvey, with the attention that goes beyond professional observation into something more like the attention you pay to people you love and are worried about. He knew that Harvey's laughter on set during that period was different from Harvey's laughter when things were going well. It was still real. The laughter, still involuntary, still the full physical surrender that made audiences love it. But there was something underneath it that Tim could see even if Harvey couldn't, something in the quality of the release that went past comedy into relief. Harvey was not just laughing. Harvey was being allowed, for a few minutes at a time, to put down something very heavy. And Tim, who understood this, had been doing something about it every day without telling Harvey what he was doing or why. He had been putting things into the sketches, specific things, calibrated things, timed not to the general laugh of the room but to the particular frequency of Harvey's specific need on each specific day. On the bad days, when Harvey came in carrying more than usual, Tim's choices in those rehearsals were different, slower, more layered, more designed to find the thing that would reach Harvey past the professional surface and into the place where the laughter lived that was separate from the performance. Harvey had not known any of this. Harvey had assumed, all of those years, that what Tim was doing was what everyone else saw, an extraordinarily talented comedian doing what he did, and Harvey's responses being the collateral result. The idea that Tim had been watching him that carefully, that specifically, that privately, for all of those years, had not occurred to Harvey. Not until he found the photograph in the drawer of his dressing room in 1975 with the writing on the back and began trying to understand what it meant. Tim Conway sat in his chair on the Tonight Show stage and said, I knew you were having a hard time. I knew because I watched you. Harvey was quiet. Tim said, I couldn't do anything about the hard time. That was yours. But I could do something about the 20 minutes in the middle of the day when we were in a sketch together. I could make that 20 minutes the 20 minutes where you put it down. Harvey's expression had moved past composure in the direction of something that was entirely his own, not a performance of emotion but the thing itself, present in his face without mediation or management. He said, Why didn't you tell me? Tim was quiet for a moment. He looked at the desk. Then he looked at Harvey. He said, Because if I told you, it would have become something you were aware of. And if you were aware of it, you would have tried to protect me from the inconvenience of it, and then it would have stopped working. The studio did not move. The audience of 300 people sat in the particular silence of people who have just been handed something true and do not yet have language for what to do with it. Johnny Carson had his hand pressed flat against his desk. His eyes were closed. Ed McMahon had turned slightly away from the camera, which was as much privacy as the cameras were going to allow him. Harvey Korman held the photograph in both hands and looked at it, and what was on his face in that moment was something that took everyone who saw it a long time to find words for afterward. The best any of them managed was this. He looked as though something had been explained, as though a very long equation that had never quite balanced had finally been shown its missing term. He looked like a man who has just understood something about the years behind him that changes the entire texture of those years, not their content, not their events, but their quality. The understanding that someone had been watching, that someone had known, that the 20 minutes every day when the weight went down had not been accidental, had not been the byproduct of talent applied generally, but had been a specific and chosen and deliberate gift applied to him every day, for years. Without being asked, Harvey placed the photograph on Johnny Carson's desk. He did it gently, in the way you place something that belongs to the person you're giving it back to. He said, I've been carrying this for 4 years because I didn't know who it belonged to." Then he looked at Tim. "Now I know. It's yours." Tim looked at the photograph on the desk. He did not pick it up immediately. He sat for a moment with his hands in his lap and his face in the expression that was Tim Conway's most honest expression, the one that appeared at the moments when the performing face dropped and what was underneath it became briefly visible. It was quiet and clear and showed something that the audience of 300 people recognized immediately as something they had not expected to see from this man, because this was Tim Conway, the funniest man in American television, the man who had never once broken character in 11 years of sketches designed specifically to break him. And what his face showed in this moment was simply this: he was moved. Not crying. Tim Conway was not going to cry on the Tonight Show stage, but moved in the specific way that the people who have spent their lives making other people feel things sometimes feel things themselves, deeply and quietly and without much of it becoming visible, like a very deep current that only shows on the surface as a slight change in the texture of the water. He picked up the photograph. He looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at Harvey. He said, "You know what I remember about that day?" Harvey said no. Tim said, "I remember thinking that you had the best laugh in the business, and I remember thinking I was going to spend the rest of my career trying to find the thing that got there." Harvey looked at him. "Every single day?" Tim was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Every single day, Harv." From the control room, someone pressed the wrong button and the audience monitor flickered once, and then the studio returned to silence. And somewhere in the audience, a woman began to cry, not quietly, in the specific way that someone cries when something true and unexpected has found them in a public place and they cannot defer it. And the sound of her crying spread through the room the way sounds spread in silence, in widening rings, until the studio that 7 minutes ago had been full of laughter was full of something entirely different and entirely the same. Both of them the sound of people who have had their guard taken down by something they didn't see coming. Johnny Carson spoke, finally. Not immediately. He gave the room a moment, the way he had always known how to give a room a moment. That particular quality of Carson's silence before he spoke, that made whatever came after it land more precisely. He looked at Tim. Then he looked at Harvey. He said, quietly, "Do you know how rare that is?" He was not asking them to answer. He was telling them something. He said, to be that known by another person, to be watched that carefully by someone who didn't need anything from you, who wasn't watching to get something, who was watching because they saw you were struggling and wanted to do something about it that you'd never have to know about. He looked at the photograph on the desk between them. He said, "Most people go their entire lives without being known that way, even once." Both men were quiet. Harvey looked at Tim. Tim was looking at the photograph. Carson said, "I've been hosting this show for 17 years, and the funniest night I've ever had was tonight, and the realest night I've ever had was also tonight." He paused, "And the reason is sitting right there." He nodded toward the photograph. The audience did not applaud. Not immediately, because what was happening in the room was not the kind of thing that resolves into applause easily. It was the kind of thing that sits in a room after it has been said, that changes the quality of the air in the room, that makes the people in the room different from what they were before they came in. Eventually the applause came, the way it always comes when people have held it long enough and can no longer hold it. And it was not the polite applause of an audience doing its job, or the excited applause of an audience responding to entertainment, but the applause of people who have been given something and are trying to find a way to say thank you for it, with the only instrument they have available. The switchboard at NBC was overwhelmed before the broadcast ended. The calls that came in were not from fans of Tim Conway or fans of Harvey Korman. They were from people who had watched a friendship operate in silence for years and had just been told what the silence had been containing, and who needed to tell someone that it had mattered to them in ways they couldn't fully account for. Tim Conway won 4 Emmy Awards in his career. Harvey Korman won 4. Neither of them, in any acceptance speech or interview or public statement in the years that followed, cited the night of February 14, 1979, as the most important thing that happened to them professionally. They did not need to. It was the kind of thing that people keep in the inner pocket of their jacket, close to the body, accessible by hand when needed, worn at one corner from being handled many times over many years. Harvey Korman passed away on May 29, 2008, at the age of 81. Tim Conway's statement was brief and contained everything that needed to be said. He said that Harvey was the best audience he had ever had, that making Harvey laugh was the thing he had done more carefully and more seriously than anything else in his professional life, and that he hoped Harvey knew, had always known, what those 20 minutes every day had been for. Among Harvey's personal effects, in the drawer of the desk in his home office, was the photograph from the first day of Carol Burnett's show rehearsal, the one with Tim's handwriting on the back, the one Harvey had placed on Johnny Carson's desk and then taken home, the one he had carried for 33 years, first without understanding it, and then with complete understanding, and had kept anyway, because some things you keep, not because they need to be held, because putting them down would mean the person who gave them to you was further away than you can stand. If you have not yet joined this channel's community, this is the moment. Becoming a member of Johnny Carson Files means being part of the group of people who believe that the real stories are the ones that remind us what we are capable of toward each other. The link is below. 30 seconds, and it means everything. Please like this video if it stayed with you, because every like finds someone else who needs to see it tonight. Subscribe so the next story finds you, and drop a comment below. Tell me where you are watching from. Tell me about the person in your life who has been watching you more carefully than you knew. The one who has been calibrating something to your frequency without telling you that's what they were doing. The one who has known which 20 minutes you needed most. You have probably never told them that you knew. Tell them. You do not need a television stage. You do not need a Valentine's Day. You do not need the right words already assembled. You need to reach into the inside pocket of whatever you carry and give back the thing that was always theirs. That is the whole job. Give it back.